If you've heard the phrase reversible cables before and you just think that sounds insane, well then you're not alone. When I came across them, first of all, I felt quite intimidated because it just seemed like such a complex thing. However, over the last year where I've been designing a pattern, I'm wearing the scarf version of it, a scone, and here's the blanket for knit stars, I really started digging into reversible cables, figuring out what they were, what you could do with them, and I realized that they're not as difficult as they seem, and they're actually a lot of fun to use. So I ended up kind of looking at two different times you would use them, because you're not going to be using them all of the time and they're not suitable for every project. But the primary time that you're going to be using them is somewhere where you want a reversible fabric. So the kind of cases you want this is if you've got a scarf and you want it to look well on both sides, or same with the blanket, it's going to look well on both sides. Or even a shawl or something where if you flip it to the other side, you don't want it to look very obviously like the wrong side of your work. So anytime you're going to be looking at both things like this. Or the other time is if you actually want to create a very warm, thick fabric, it's also a very good way of doing that. Because most of the time with cables, you're drawing in your work. So if you've got a certain number of stitches, we'll say 20 stitches that are this wide with standard stockinette stitch. When you do a standard cable, it's going to pull it in a little bit. It'll make it thicker. Like if you turn it sideways, it's going to be a denser or thicker fabric, and it's going to be a lot warmer and cozier in it, but a little stiffer as well. When you're doing reversible cables, particularly if you're looking at ones where you're turning it to both sides, where you're cabling on both sides of your work, you're talking about a much denser fabric. In fact, it's so dense that it's often useful to even go up a needle size, or to actually to start making it so that you're kind of keeping things a little bit looser if possible. And you have to really pay attention to that when you are creating your project or thinking about your project, so that if it's something that's very dense, you want to make sure that that's going to work for the project. Something like a scarf or a blanket, that works very well. If you're thinking about doing something reversible for a clothing garment, first of all, it probably doesn't have a lot of advantage to you for most of the garment, and also it's going to make it very thick. The only exception I could see to that is if you had a cable cardigan and then you had a fold over collar, then it's going to work great, because one side of it up here, the cable will look well, and then if you fold it over, instead of what looks like a wrong side, you'll actually have a cable all over the second side. So that would be one case in a garment that it would work well. And because it's just going to be the collar and the fold over section, it's not going to be too much. It won't bulk the garment out too much. So there's a couple of different kind of cables you can look at for reversible cables. I kind of put them into two main categories. First one is ribbing. So the middle of this, you've got 1x1 ribbing. And when you're looking at 1x1 ribbing on one side, because the knit stitches stand up, it looks like stockinette stitch. But when you turn it over to the other side, 1x1 ribbing is also going to look the same on the other side. So you end up with a cable that looks like a cable on both sides. The only difference being that instead of it being knit on one side and purl on the other, you're doing knit, purl on both sides. So the difference being, you can see it goes in like this, and on this side it goes out like this. So it's not a total mirror image, it's going to be the inverse on each side, but it still looks like a cable, and you can kind of flip it around to make it look different depending on which way you want it to be. Other kind is ribbing, but wider ribbing, where you've got, like in this case, it's 3x3 ribbing. This is a section from the bear sweater that I've done. It's all done in ribbing, and the cables are crossed over on this side. This one is a little bit different in the middle because you're swapping between knit and purl, so if you ignore that. But the other sections where you're crisscrossing back and forth, it'll mean the ones that are knit stitch on one side will look like the cable, but if you're crossing over sections that are purl but they're going to be knit on the other side, will look like a cable there. Alternatively, it might be where you cable the knit sides on this side, and then if you're doing maybe 4x4, you could do it bigger, it could be 6x6. and then the other ones you cross on the other side. So you're basically treating both sides as the front of the work, cabling on the right side and the wrong side, but doing the cables on the knit stitches. Or you can also even do the cables on the purl stitches if you want to keep it all in one row. So both of those tend to be the most common types of cables. There's one more cable type that is kind of a variant on this, but it is quite tricky. And what it is with that one is you're running two sets of cables, or you're treating both sides of the front of the work. Those ones, they're not fully reversible, but they are cables on both sides. So what you'd have is you might have one particular cable stitch on this side, and then you are operating a completely different cable stitch on the other side. So that is far and away the most complex type cables to be working, because you treat both sides fully as the right side of the work, and it's twice the amount of cables, and they make extremely dense, unforgiving fabrics. Those ones, I actually feel like they're a bit more trouble than they're worth. They do, because the fabric doesn't feel great, and it's very, very easy to lose track of where you're at with it. But the other two types, with the 1x1 ribbing and just treating each side as a vertical cable so that it looks well on both sides, they're both very straightforward to do. They are very useful because of the fact that you'll have a front side on both sides. And so it's going to be great for reversible fabrics that you want to be able to show both sides of it. So that's just a brief overview of reversible cables. If you want to learn more about it, you've got Knit Stars has got a class on it, and we're also going to be doing a reversible cable project in Celtic Knit Club 2025. So drop any questions you've got on reversible cables below.